Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew. You've probably heard these names and maybe even used them interchangeably. But what if I told you they're not just synonyms? Each one is actually a distinct chapter in an incredible story, a story of identity, faith, and survival. Today, we're going to unpack them and see what really separates them.
So let's just get right to it. The big question. Are these three names just different ways of saying the same thing? Well, yes and no. It's a bit more complicated than that. While they are all deeply connected, each name marks a very specific moment in history, and each one carries a unique meaning that kind of builds on the one that came before it.
To really get this, we have to go way back. I mean, all the way back, to the beginning of the story, to a man named Abraham, who becomes this massive figure, the patriarch of a nation. It's right there, in his story, that the first of these three identities shows up. The very first time we see this term is in the book of Genesis. Right in the middle of this big story about warring kings, the text points out Abram the Hebrew. Now, think about that. It doesn't say Abram the shepherd or Abram from Ur. It specifically calls him the Hebrew. That tells you right away that this name is a huge part of his identity. So what does it actually mean?
Well, scholars have a few really compelling ideas. One is pretty straightforward. It's just about his family tree, linking the name back to an ancestor named Abram. Another one, which is kind of beautiful, comes from the Hebrew root word avar, which means to cross over. This fits Abraham's story perfectly, right? He literally crossed the Euphrates River, leaving his old life behind to follow this divine call. Then there's a third theory that even connects Hebrew to a group known in ancient texts as the Habiru, a word used for wanderers and outsiders.
So here's the key takeaway. It doesn't really matter which theory you lean into because they all point to the exact same powerful idea. To be a Hebrew was to be separate. You were an outsider. It was an identity defined not by a piece of land, but by a journey, a crossing over into a brand new destiny.
Okay, so the story keeps building. A few generations later, the spotlight moves to Abraham's grandson, Jacob. And it's through this incredibly dramatic, life-changing moment that a new name and a whole new identity for an entire people is forged. This is one of the most mysterious and, honestly, amazing scenes in the Bible. Jacob is all alone, he's on the run, and he wrestles all night long with a divine being. Now, his original name, Jacob, means something like supplanter. It's got this hint of deception to it. But after this struggle, he's given a new name, Israel, which means he who strives with God. This wasn't just a new nickname, it was a sign of a massive internal transformation. And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The man known as Jacob was kind of compliant, easily swayed, and he often used subtle tricks. But to become the father of a nation, he had to become Israel, a man who was solid, determined, ready to take bold action. The cautious guy had to be replaced by the patriarch, who could literally wrestle with God and come away with a blessing. And that name change was truly prophetic. It marks the exact moment a single family starts to become a nation. You see, Jacob's 12 sons would become the heads of the 12 tribes, and from that point forward, they'd be known together as the children of Israel. For centuries, this was their defining national identity. But history is never that simple, is it? The nation of Israel would grow into a powerful kingdom, but it would also break apart. And it's out of this really painful history of division, destruction, and ultimately survival that our third and final name comes into play, Jew.
So let's just quickly walk through this timeline. After King Solomon, the kingdom splits in two. You have the 10 northern tribes who keep the name Israel, and the southern tribes, mostly Judah and Benjamin, who form the kingdom of Judah. Then, in 722 BCE, the Assyrians sweep in and conquer the northern kingdom, scattering those 10 tribes. They become the famous Lost Tribes. About 150 years later, the Babylonians conquer the south, destroying Jerusalem and the temple. It's the people from this southern kingdom, Judah, who survive, exile, and come back, who become known as Yehudim, or in English, Jews. So what does that mean? It means the term Jew started out as a name for a people from a specific place, the Kingdom of Judah. It specifically points to the remnant of the Israelite nation that made it through the exile, returned home, and rebuilt everything. They were the ones who carried the story and the covenant into the future.
Okay, so we've got the historical origins down. But that just leads to another question. How did people back then think about these terms? How did they relate to each other?
For a long time, there was one very influential theory that everyone went by. But as modern scholars have dug in,
they've found the origins of that theory are, well, deeply problematic. Here are the two main ways of looking at it. The older theory, the insider/outsider one, said that Israel was the respectful name the people used for themselves, while Jew was what outsiders called them, sometimes as an insult. The more modern, evidence-based whole/part theory says, no, Israel was always the big picture category for the whole covenant people, while Jew referred to a specific historical part of that group, the folks from Judah. And this is where the story gets really wild and frankly pretty disturbing. That old insider/outsider theory, it was pushed into the mainstream in 1938 by a German scholar named Carl Georg Kuhn. And here's the crucial bit of context. Kuhn was an enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party. He was essentially taking the toxic, anti-Semitic environment of 1930s Germany, where the word Jude was absolutely used as a slur, and projecting it backwards onto ancient history. The problem? There is just no ancient evidence to support the idea that Jew was a derogatory term used by outsiders. None. And this really gets to the heart of the modern understanding. As scholar Dr. Jason Staples puts it so clearly, the ancient evidence consistently shows that Jews are a subset of the bigger category of Israel. They're the branch of the family tree that comes from the kingdom of Judah. It's a historical fact, not an insult.
So, let's bring all of this together. It's so important to see that these names aren't just replacements, where one stops and the next one begins. No, they are overlapping layers, and each one adds a new dimension to this incredibly complex and enduring identity. And maybe the perfect example of this is the Apostle Paul. If you actually look at how he describes himself in his own writings, you can see one person holding all three of these identities at the very same time. It shows they weren't mutually exclusive at all, but were different facets of who he was. Just look at this line from his letter to the Romans. Paul lays out his identity so carefully. He says he's an Israelite, a member of the covenant nation. Then he traces his roots back even further, to the seed of Abraham, the original Hebrew. And finally, he gets specific. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, which was part of the southern kingdom of Judah, making him, historically, a Jew. Let's just break that down one more time. When he says seed of Abraham, he's connecting to that very first identity, the Hebrew who crossed over. When he says Israelite, he's connecting to the national covenant of Jacob's descendants. And by identifying as a Benjaminite, he's placing himself squarely within that historical remnant known as the Jews. You see, he's all three. So when you put it all together, it becomes so clear. These names tell a single, continuous story. Hebrew is the chapter of origin and separation. Israelite is the chapter of nationhood and covenant. And Jew is the chapter of endurance, of survival, of carrying that promise forward. They aren't different stories. They're three chapters of one incredible narrative. So we're left with this thought. This whole journey through just 3 words reveals this rich tapestry of history and theology and identity. And it kind of makes you think about the power of labels in our own lives, doesn't it? How do the names that we use for ourselves and for other people tell a story not just about where we've all been, but about who we're becoming?